Ok, 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 ok. Sí, ok, dos.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Sergio Guzmão Suchodolski. I'm the Senior Fellow at SEBRI, the Brazilian Center for International Relations, and co-responsible with Maria Neto and all the colleagues around the table that I will briefly introduce to you for this panel. I would like to thank the Financing Commons Summit for the invitation to chair this meeting, which has a little bit of a peculiarity because as Maria and I started working early on in this session, we decided to co-create a white paper, which some of you may have read and will be available on the Financing Commons Summit webpage, that it's called Public Development Banks and Philanthropy. I would like to reference the co-authors of this white paper, some of which are members of this table. Others are here with us at the audience, and some could not make it to Cartagena, but I'm sure they wish they were here for sure. So I would like to thank Frank Schroeder from E3G. Frank is here. Where is Frank? Thank you, Frank. I'd like to thank Juan Martinez from the Inter-American Development Bank. I don't know if he's in the room, but he's in Cartagena. He's very busy. I'd like to thank Diana Smallridge from Momentos Global. Diana, thank you. Corey Van Gaal from Momentos Global as well. I'd like to thank Javier Garcia Moritan, who's here with us. Javier, from GDFE, which is the group that gathers the Argentinian non-governmental organizations. Is that correct? Carolina Suarez from Latin Impacto. Carolina is here representing Colombia. We are at her turf. Juan Lozano from Impacta, who I believe is with us. Juan, thank you for being with us. Renata Piazon from Arapiaú Institute. Renata is here with us. Arapiaú is probably one of the largest philanthropies in Brazil and a member of WINGS and also the Funders Table. Barbara Bushner from the Climate Policy Initiative, the executive director, couldn't come here but contributed to the paper, is a co-author. And Natalia Diaz, the managing director for BNDES, the Brazilian Development Bank, that is here with us. So at the beginning, we put together this white paper, and we not only we have some analysis, but we have concrete suggestions that Maria will address in her presentation, in her keynote, going forward for the three main stakeholders of this relationship between philanthropies, development banks, and governments and private sector. Let me introduce to you our colleagues who are here with us today. Other than the ones that I already introduced, we have Paul Bodner, a director at Bezos Earth Institute. Paul, can you say hello to everyone? Thank you for joining us. I have on my side Matthias Bendersky, who's the general manager for outreach at IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank. And we have also Maria Eugenia Paes from WINGS. Thank you, Maria Eugenia. And Mireia Villar-Froners from the United Nations, the resident coordinator for Colombia and the region. Mireia, it's such a pleasure to have you with us. You will certainly bring the flag of the SDGs to this conversation, I suppose. So without further ado, I would like to invite my colleague Maria Neto, my co-chair here, to start with the keynote, and where we will investigate a little bit this white paper before we start the round of discussions. Maria, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sergio. It's a great pleasure to be here with everybody. First of all, I want to give to Diana the congrats for the name of No Longer Strangers, which was a very inspired name for the paper. And so coming on, a very quick overview of what the paper is about and how we, let me hope that this whole works, how we came about that. As Sergio said, we were a couple of people, like some philanthropies, some people from development banks, trying to think about how we can bridge this gap between public development banks and philanthropies to work together, particularly knowing that we need to have financial innovation, we need to work in a different way to find tailored solutions for scaling up sustainable and green investments, be it for local situations as well as for the kind of scale we are talking about. But we also acknowledge that we need to dig in on why those resources are today not working together yet. We have similar kind of goals between these two players. Both philanthropies and PDBs are looking for SDGs. They have this kind of development goals as the core of their work. But they are different sources of funding, very different source of funding, and they do have different ways of operations, and we have to start digging on how to work together and understand these differences to be able to bridge the work. No? So the differences and the opportunities, on the one hand, the philanthropies, which I'm now representing one, and I used to be on the IDB, so it's interesting to see these two roles, and even within my own area of work now. Basically, philanthropies have this opportunity to do, I would say, more tailored and innovative work. They can take risk. They can work on providing expertise. They can go where some others would not go. They can work with the kind of players that maybe markets will not be able to go. And they can have different representation. And I think it's important to acknowledge, for example, we have Bezos here, big philanthropy, but we also have national philanthropies here, like Arapiaú. And we have also regional, like Latin Impacta. So we have different types of philanthropies with different kinds of mandates as well. PDBs, on the other hand, they have a huge potential for also leveraging and catalyzing climate finance, green and sustainable finance. They have this government mandate to be the ones kind of supporting the development plans and goals of their countries. But they also have this local knowledge of the capital markets, the financial markets, and the local players, and the kinds of barriers you need to address to leverage the investments. No? So with the paper, actually tried to explore a couple of things. We first explored the possibility and what are the opportunities of combining the funds if we were to suppose that they can work together. We do see a huge opportunity, and we explore a bit in the paper, and I encourage all of you to read it, that actually blended finance is something that could be done, and you could have different ways to combine resources for investments vehicles where philanthropies can take certain types of risks, and public banks could structure those vehicles and be a way also to leverage this capital. And we also explore that actually this discussion about the finance of vehicles should not just be focused on a local level, but we need a global discussion on best practices to be able also to replicate this further. At the same time, we recognize that there are two kinds of different sets. Now, we have barriers and problems that we need to look at. And for instance, philanthropies, if I take the example of Brazil, we have problems sometimes to use philanthropic resources as source of funds that will result in investments, even by law, because the local regulations do not yet recognize the possibility of using these resources, and they may ask for taxes and so on. Also, it's a learning experience still, even for governments themselves, to create enabling environments for these philanthropies to be able to work more flexibly. They also have both public banks and philanthropies different burdens and different types of ways to report, because their donors, their owners are very different. And also the types of impact and the type of monitoring, reporting that it would be required to do is very different. In one case, you are looking at a very financial kind of way of operating. In the other, you have this important specific social impact you are supposed to demonstrate. At the same time, we have a lot of opportunities. We have opportunities to explore technical skills and expertise of both players. They can have access to new networks that both players could work better together. This provides a lot of opportunity for innovation, agility, flexibility, and also the philanthropies bring this opportunity to also work more on advocacy and influence, which is something sometimes public banks cannot do entirely. No? So the paper makes a couple of recommendations, and I will not go through them in detail. But I think what is important is that, as you can see, we are seeing a number of things that could become kind of a roadmap of work that we can look in the financing common, and we are going to try to have this actually as part of the common declaration of the financing common as areas of work that we could explore together. And I hope through WINGS and through the FIX and the public banks here, we are able to develop this maybe next financing common to have an update. And very specifically, we think that this also requires homework from different players. So we do call for action from the different players. So we call for action from the national governments, as I said, because it's important that the governments indeed provides enabling conditions for blended resources. As I mentioned, at least in Brazil today, this is still a barrier for us to scale up this considerably. They could also support matchmaking platforms, and there could be many ways on actually bringing resources together and facilitating it. There is a couple of examples that we highlight in the paper. We have the BNDES example that we'll talk here about this kind of matchmaking platforms. PDBs also need to kind of change a bit the way to work. In a way, they need to also consider how they can complement their financial roles with non-financial mechanisms, with ways to engage with philanthropic funds, looking at more specific and sophisticated impacts, and different ways also to combine efforts in terms of developing blended finance initiatives that can be a bit more innovative and allow this kind of combination of resources, which is often not yet done really by PDBs today. There is a lot of pilots, but again, in terms of scale, we have a lot of opportunities. And philanthropies need to change as well. Philanthropies are used, and we also describe this a bit in the paper, to do a lot of assistance-focused work. But we could actually promote and provoke philanthropies to also use more resources for blended de-risking. And blended doesn't mean necessarily only blended in financial instruments. It could also be blended in terms of developing pipelines of projects, combining technical cooperation with finance. No? So that there could be a work of trying to be a bit more, let's say, innovative with regards to that. And also that means a better understanding, and a better engagement of the philanthropic world with this kind of public development, financial kind of markets, and the need for also working with governments. So I think here is a bit of a provocation also for kind of a more engaged and sophisticated dialogue with regards to that. And I stop here. I mean, I just encourage everybody to have a look at the paper. It's a short paper, it's a white paper, and it's a provocation that we have here for the table to discuss today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you. Full room. I'm very pleased to see that, and many familiar faces and colleagues. So we will start the roundtable. I'll pass to Maria Eugenia. She's from WINGS. Maybe you could talk a little bit about WINGS network, and you will address the enabling environment. Maria Eugenia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sergio, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Maria Eugenia Paez. I'm from WINGS. WINGS is a global community of philanthropic organizations, and we work to strengthen domestic ecosystems of philanthropy with different philanthropic actors. And we are here because we see that this type of contributions need to leverage the voice of philanthropy and the role that philanthropy has in development. there is a crucial element for philanthropies to contribute effectively with public development banks, and that is the enabling environment. There are 3 barriers that the philanthropic sector faces, not only in Latin America and the Caribbean, but in other regions such as Africa or Asia. I'm going to mention 3, as I said. One is the lack of tax incentive. Within the incentive system for donations, there are some factors that could affect mobilizing resources from donors, and that is the tax on donations, and that means that you donate and you pay because you are donating. And the amount or the limitations in the amounts that you can donate with tax incentives. So this is something that could limit the participation of domestic philanthropy and foundations in mechanisms such as vendor finance, contributing with non-reimbursable resources. So that is thinking on domestic ecosystem. That is something that we need to address. Other barrier is the restrictive of limited regulations on endowments. In 2022, last year, Wings with CEFIS from Chile and with Indiana University published a document that analyzes the regulatory frameworks in Latin America and the Caribbean for donations and for the nonprofit sector. And we found that only 7 out of 33 countries in the region have a beneficial and a clear regulation on endowments with philanthropic purposes. So there is a challenge in this region, and we know that in other countries, in other regions, this is something that we share, this challenge, and is to improve the regulations on endowments for philanthropic purposes, because in this case, this could limit the investment of foundations in mechanisms such as blended finance. And the third barrier that I want to mention is the restrictions to the civic space, not only for philanthropy, but also for civil society, and this limit the capacity to contribute in addressing development needs. One example of this restriction is the cross-border giving limitations that we see not only in Latin America, but in other regions, and that could affect the capacity for philanthropy, domestic philanthropy, to partner with international funders and to create this ecosystem between public development banks, international philanthropy, and domestic philanthropy. So that's the barriers. And finally, I would like to highlight that to create an enabling environment for philanthropy to collaborate effectively with public development banks and various actors, we need to create trust between philanthropy and governments and public development banks in this case too. And we need to create a common understanding of the sector, what are the barriers, and at Wings we provide that support, and we are committed to contributing, building that capacity at the national, regional, and global level. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll now start with the philanthropies, and we have here with us the Executive Director of Arapiaú, Renata Piazon. Renata, I would like you to give us some advice on what you see in terms of foundation and other philanthropic organizations, what they could do more on climate. But first, please introduce yourself and Arapiaú and its rich history and the programs you are involved with, especially with the development banks. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sergio. Well, I'm Renata. I'm the General Director of Arapiaú. Arapiaú is a Brazilian philanthropy that works on climate and development. We are also part of the Funders Table together with Bezos Earth Fund. Funders Table is a group of international climate philanthropists that invests $3 billion a year on climate mitigation. And we have been working on climate and development for Brazil in the Amazon region for the last 15 years. So just to provide some numbers, philanthropy invested globally $12 billion since the Paris Agreement. This is data from ClimateWorks from 2023. And in Brazil, 290 million was invested in philanthropy since the Paris Agreement, and being almost 50% on forests. But if we look into Brazilian philanthropy, the GIFI, the group of Brazilian foundations census, states that 5 billion reais was invested in 2020. This was the last census in Brazil. And 40% of this funding went to the environment and sustainability. But philanthropy in Brazil is still much focused on contributions through donations. So 89% of philanthropic institutions doing donations, and only 13% thinking about blended finance initiatives or new financial mechanisms. So the first thing that I would like to stress is that funding from philanthropy, yes, it is necessary, but this is not how we're going to change things. Philanthropy needs to work as enabler, as influencer, as connector, convener of unusual gatherings, innovator. And there's an opportunity to innovate on new financial mechanisms, such as blended finance. At least this is the view for Brazil right now. And the second advice is that we cannot dissociate the climate and development agenda. We have done that in the past. So in 2012, when we had, again, in Brazil, the lowest deforestation rates, we couldn't promote development and sustain development in the Amazon region. So for that to be state policy and not dependent on governments, we need to promote an integrated development agenda. And social is the most important. So people need to be at the center of the equation. And I have two examples of that we already worked in Arapiaú as philanthropy. The first one is that we gathered indigenous communities, quilombolas and ribeirinhos, local communities, and we asked them, what do you need to stay in your territory? And the main answer, especially from youth, was connectivity. And that's not usual to fund connectivity, like climate philanthropies to fund connectivity, but we accepted and we started to incubate a project on connectivity in the foundation that aims to reach 5,000 communities in the Amazon region. But again, philanthropy won't solve that. This is a $100 million project that we raised in philanthropy $15 million. But we need public development banks, and we need to unlock public policies to make this happen. So philanthropy has a role on proving the concept and on making this happening, and on listening to the territory and proving the concept of new projects and new ideas for them, public development banks and private finance to unlock and scale. And the second example is regarding smallholder farmers, and we have a very special experience in the state of Bahia with BNDES. As you may know, cocoa is a traditional culture in the south region of Bahia, where it's grown in native forest. And the production of cocoa is mostly family farming, so smallholder farmers, with low income to producers due to low productivity, low added value to the project. So we developed a rural credit pilot project for technical assistance with philanthropy for cocoa producers in the south region of Bahia, and that showed an increase of 40% in the average gross income of farmers. So from this pilot, we designed a financial product in blended finance which provided credit with technical assistance. that was called Sustainable CRA, the Certificate of Agribusiness Receivables, and that was chosen by BNDES in its first public selection bid for hybrid financial structures to support blended finance initiatives. So that's an example. It's a small-scale example because it's 600 smallholder farmers, 6,000 hectares preserved. But I think it's a great example for you to imagine the potential of scaling that blended finance mechanisms if we look into designing the projects from the beginning with philanthropy and public development banks. And just as final remarks, first, as Maria emphasized, we need to ensure that blended finance takes into account the local context and the perspective of civil society. It's not what the Amazonians, we need to think about what, in the context of Brazil, what the Amazonians want and not what we think they want. So in this case, for example, of connectivity, that's what they need to stay in the territory and to protect the territory. So that's what we should fund on the climate agenda. And we need to make best use of philanthropies as enabler, as bridge builder, as provider of this catalytic capital, all of which can be leveraged in collaboration with PDBs. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Renata. You all noticed that we also not only put together the paper, but we had to be a little bit curators of this session. And I just wanted to reference that because you will understand the different views that we try to put together. Bringing networks of philanthropies from different regions of the world, bringing a multilateral development bank of the size of IDB, bringing a national development bank from the global south as BNDES, bringing a philanthropy from the south as Arapiaú. And now we have a global philanthropy represented here by Paul Bodner. Paul, we've known each other for a little while. You already had different hats in your life, very interesting hats, working for the US government, then BlackRock, and now at Bezos Earth Institute. I think the same question that I asked Renata fits well for you, but please tell us a little bit about your mission at Bezos, and of course, what advice you have for other foundations and philanthropic organizations, specifically on tackling the climate change challenges. The floor is yours, Paul. A pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Sergio. Hello, everybody. Let me give you a very short introduction to the Bezos Earth Fund. Is a $10 billion commitment from Jeff Bezos, the founder of the company Amazon, to protect climate and nature over the course of this decade. It's the largest philanthropic commitment ever made to that mission, and the small team of people who work at the Earth Fund therefore feel the enormous pressure of delivering on that mission. We are active across climate and nature, which is a little bit unusual. And we have very robust programs here in this region in Latin America. For example, we've committed so far around $200 million to in the Amazon and the tropical Andes to protect forests and to promote new and alternative paths to prosperity for communities that have so far depended on extractive models, economic models in the region. But our mandate is global, and we focus on everything from industrial decarbonization to land restoration and mangroves and everything in between. So as Sergio mentioned, I've had the opportunity to work in this field of climate finance for almost 25 years in public and private. And it's been very striking to come here to Cartagena because I think this is a very interesting moment to see the public development banks becoming more united and more coherent is actually a very important development in the story of how the financial architecture is evolving to help the world deal with the challenges of sustainability. Everybody may be talking out there about the reform of the MDBs and what we do about the Bretton Woods institutions, but meanwhile, this very powerful and very diverse set of actors is showing up. And it's been very encouraging to see. And so, although I appreciate that your paper put public development banks and philanthropies on the same footing, I think actually philanthropy is really here to support PDBs to do their work. We are not a systemic actor with a systemic mission. We're here to support PDBs to do their job. And because we're talking about finance, we're also here to help markets do jobs that we need markets to do, and to address market failures that might prevent them from doing so. That's, Sergio, that's how I see our kind of mission in this story. So how can we do that? I'll just give you a few examples. We can help the world of public development banks build their capacity to become greener institutions and to do green finance. You already do a lot of capacity building across these institutions, but I'll just give you an example. A few years ago, a group, Philanthropies supported, AFD actually hosted a green bank design summit, which brought together representatives from existing green banks, publicly owned, commercially operated financial institutions focusing on green investment, with about 20 developing countries that were in the process of designing versions of a green investment bank. I think IDB was a sponsor of that as well, under Maria's leadership. And it's amazing. It was amazing to see just how one multi-day kind of intensive workshop and training method sparked so much activity in countries that were just starting on their journey to either establish new green banks or to green existing development banks. So we can do more of that. Secondly, you mentioned bridge building in your paper, and Renata, you mentioned the importance of philanthropy being a connector, a convener, an enabler. We, especially those of us who worked in public and private, can help public development banks work more effectively with private finance, because these two communities both have such an important role to play, but sometimes they feel like magnets, where you try to make the magnets touch each other and they they don't. So we can help reverse the polarity through our convening and other initiatives. Third, we can help build important market infrastructure that's needed to channel capital to the places that it's needed to go. For example, we've had some interesting conversations here about the difficulty of getting investment in nature up to speed with investment in decarbonization or climate. Because with climate, we all understand that we can use carbon, CO2e, as a reserve currency. We can measure everything in terms of emissions or emissions reduced. We can do tons per, dollars per ton. We have all of these. We know where the emissions come from. In some cases, it's more complicated than others, but it's a simple problem compared to preserving biodiversity or investing in nature. What does that even mean? And so if we want to be able to do the work of managing natural capital and valuing nature at more than zero, that's going to require a lot of basic market infrastructure to define the ecosystem services we care about, to figure out how to measure stocks, track flows, integrate into national accounting, into corporate accounting, value, and create the plumbing into the financial system. And again, philanthropies can help be patrons of that work. And finally, we can, of course, co-invest, and we need to do more co-investment and through blended finance and other vehicles. But that investment has to be enabling some kind of transformation. There is a bottomless need for capital expenditure, and philanthropy can't just put money into the bottomless hole of CapEx need. It has to be serving some sort of purpose to demonstrate models that get new business models going. So those are some ideas, and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. So now I'll give the floor to Carolina Suarez from Latin Impacto. Carolina just hosted a wonderful annual meeting in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and has a track record of many collaborations with development banks. So Carolina, I would love for you to introduce your organization and the work that you do with development banks. The floor is yours.
Muito obrigada, Sergio. Prazer para mim estar aqui com você hoje. Now in my country, I'm from Colombia, but it's glad that you say that I'm from Colombia because many people will refer to me and say, she's from Latin America. And yes, I am from Latin America. I'm representing a Latin American network that we will establish 2 years ago. Today we have almost 200 members, and we work with some of them. Most of you are here, sitting at this table in this room, and it's a pleasure to be here, sharing a little more how we are working, how we are connecting philanthropies and public development banks. So I want to thank this panel because I think it's the first one that we are presenting concrete actions. So Maria, Sergio, thank you for making this effort a reality, and Eugenia, thank you for convening as a network all this panel. Yesterday, the forum opened with a video, and I loved a quote that is guiding this panel. And they said, the impact is triggered when knowledge becomes action. And I think that this document is key to become action. So I'm happy to be here and highlighting the importance of reinventing ourselves. So Paul, I completely agree with you, and how public development banks, philanthropies, as Arapayu, Bezos funds are working together, but also the IDB, CAF, BNDES are also interested. So now it's not adopted, okay, how we will work. No, it's imperative. We should work, it's a must. So how to collaborate with more concessional and how we can accelerate change. So we need to tailor projects. We need to work more together. It's something we have been listening over these 2 years. Trust and respect for communities, education on new financial instruments, and the importance of understanding the continuum of capital. For me, continuum of capital is one of my mantras. It's understanding that the capital is not only one answer. You have to use your capital depending on the risk that you have to take. Philanthropy, impact investors, are you looking for financial return or not? But understanding how do you want to use this capital. And second is understanding that we cannot leave to any single actor the creation of impact. And we're seeing here in this table how philanthropies, how public development banks, how companies, families, all of us are committed to create impact. It's not only one single actor. It's not, oh no, your foundation is the one that will create impact, but my family office is not involved with that. So yesterday talking to Renata that she is leading a foundation, but it's a conglomerate of a company, of a family office, and a foundation. So you are fully committed with this commitment of how to create impact along your continuum of capital. So we cannot live in a single actor recreation of impact. But also, so we have here philanthropists, public development banks, but what happens with intermediaries? And I am representing a network. They're very important to have this kind of networks because they are the only ones that are fully committed every day to create these connections. Because now we end this forum, and what happened then? We want to see you next year in the next forum? No, we will continue working every day. So this is the idea of how we are enable this trust-based giving. It's how we're connecting. It's how Javi from Argentina is connecting their foundations in Argentina. It's how Maria Eugenia is connecting global support organizations. And we from Latin Impacto, how we can mobilize the more strategic deployment of capital across this continuum of capital. So we believe the convenient power of bringing together diverse partners and allies. And we harness the power of collective action by leveraging the expertise and capabilities of public development banks and investors to support scalable and effective solutions at multiple levels. Last week, as you mentioned, Sergio, we had our conference in Brazil, and it was amazing because we were received by more than 250 Brazilians. And it's great to see this integration from Brazil, because we are not connected at all as a region, but we saw that. 600 people Latin Americans or investors interested and seeing Latin America, Paul, as you mentioned, as a region full of opportunities. Latin America is a region full of opportunities, and we are here to show you that. It's because now you are investing in our region, and you too, of course, Mireia from Spain. So we need to show the value that we are showing us, the value that we are bringing to the region, and as part of this value, we launched our first catalytic fund with the IDB. So Matthias is part of this fund, and we launched that last week. The idea of this fund is to have a novel instrument of collective impact by bringing together leading organizations from Latin America and the world, and how we can work together to support Scope 3, decarbonization solutions, mixing technology and biology approaches. We want to use venture philanthropy, so the idea of the fund is how we can support organizations and how they can understand the venturing capacity and philanthropy and the importance of philanthropic capital to finance and scale high impact initiatives, as you mentioned, Paul. We will also include some pilot programs. We need to test, we need to take risks. We are talking how to take risks, so this fund will be an opportunity to take risks. So now we have companies as Coca-Cola. They signed the first agreement last week. So Matthias, now we have the first company committed with us, with the IDB, and we're looking for more companies and foundations that can be part of this amazing fund that will transform not only the region, but we want to have a focus in the Amazon to show how you are doing and how we can promote more investments as you are doing in Arapaiu in Brazil. So we want to use different financial instruments because we need to understand that the financial instruments are at the service of impact. It's not only using grants, it's how we can use all these diverse financial mechanisms to create impact. And I'm sure that working together with the development banks, BNDES, BID, CAF, working together with philanthropists like you, but also with companies and families, we will create the change. So for me, I love the title, We Are Not Strangers, but the title is not only between public development banks and philanthropists. It's the whole market, how we want to make this change, working together. And this fund will transform the way that we will create solutions for the climate challenges.
Thank you so much, Carolina. Well, we heard already some very concrete examples of how this collaboration between philanthropies and PDBs are taking place, many of which are empowered by the Inter-American Development Bank. So we have Matthias Bendersky with us today. He's the General Manager for Outreach and Partnerships. You have a long career at the Inter-American Development Bank. We've known each other for quite some time now. You've been a country representative, you played various roles. What would you suggest to improve this cooperation between philanthropy and PDBs? And please feel free to introduce to the audience the work that your group does inside the IDB. Thank you, Matthias.
Thank you, Sergio. What do we need to improve this? What if I say meetings like this, papers like that, and I shut up and don't say anything else? So there's a couple of things. We do have experience. I would say some experience. If you put it in context with what we do with bilaterals or other MDBs or even corporates, you know, what we do with philanthropies is little. So there is a lot of room to grow, and I think it was very well put by Maria on the paper. So when in our experience, when we are sort of talking to philanthropies, and this is, I don't want to generalize here because there's philanthropies and philanthropies, but when we talk about working with the bank, usually one of the things that like stand out as being interesting for some of the philanthropies are the executing capacity that the IDB has, sort of the policy dialogue that we bring along, this long-term engagement that I think Paul was mentioning, evaluation capacity. I always joke around our evaluation capacity and how expensive it is to do an impact evaluation, and how many PhDs do we have, and of course the World Bank and other organizations. The demography of PhDs it's really high when we talk about the amount of economic regressions that these guys do every day to try to make sure to measure the baseline and the impact. The leverage, of course, that we bring, not only with the particular initiative that we could be co-financing together or working together with, but also the things that we do sort of as a more sort of systemic approach, right, to the countries. And of course, the scaling up. So if there is something small or we can organize to do something small with a philanthropy, then there is at least the expectation that we can scale it up, and we can scale it up with the dialogue that we have with the governments. On our end, I mean, I think it was said before, and I think Maria put it well in the paper. That the capacity to innovate. I think that's what we're craving. It's sometimes, I'm not saying, I think we have very talented people, and we do a lot of innovations, especially financial innovations when it comes to our projects. And there's a few colleagues here in the room that have done those themselves, and we do have a lot of demand for those. But I think that financial innovation in general, is something that it comes easier in a leaner philanthropy, as said before. The expertise, sometimes we do have expertise, but we complement the expertise with expertise from the other side, I would say. Leverage, we also look for leverage. I mean, it's not only us that provide the leverage. We also look for leverage when we talk to philanthropies, and sometimes that leverage comes from the risking or re-risking, as the president says, operations. So on a little bit on our end and our experience, we did have in the beginning of this relationship, more structural with philanthropies, relationship with the Gates Foundation, for example, and they were very focused on health. And I think that they were attracted to work with the IDB for all these things that I've mentioned before. It's also Gates and Slim Foundation, actually. That was $180 million. So it's not it wasn't a small project. This is a Mesoamerica health initiative. It was a child maternal initiative throughout Mesoamerica. Then Canada and Spain also joined forces with us. But I think that the thing that attracted them the most, and I'll explain a little bit of the features of the program, but it was the fact that we did have this policy dialogue, that they could bring sort of the element that the government was missing to prioritize this within their envelope. So for the people that don't know, IDB works with envelopes in each country, so we cannot go above that envelope ourselves with our funding. So this would provide sort of a little bit of an edge, because it will definitely provide a discount for the lending that we would bring in a specific topic like health that may or may not have been prioritized by the government. So that was the entry point. And then the governments themselves, the structure was a results-based initiative that when KPIs were met, they were entitled to certain amount of grant funding. That we repeated in another successful, I would say, initiative called the Malaria Elimination Facility, also with Gates. The good thing there, and why I say it was successful, was because, a couple of months ago, I think very recently, Belize was certified free of malaria. So, and I think we can attribute part of that to our program. We did work with smaller philanthropies especially in Brazil with FEMSA, with Porticus, with Open Society, with Bernard Lear Foundation, and Maria Soto Vidigal for an early childhood development fund. It was a small thing, but I think it was really a testament of what could be done. with Philanthropies. And it was like a big effort from IDB side to organize ourselves around, regular meetings with 5 foundations. On the reporting, it was a little bit of a nightmare because everybody has their own systems, their own metrics. So it was complicated. I think we all understood at the IDB that was a good testament of what we could do with philanthropy. So, there was a big effort from the bank to do it. Recently, and this is more on the education, more on the social side, recently we have engaged with GEAP, and Isabel Beltran is around here, right there. And we found out that there were, recently, in the recent year, well, not 5-10 years, that there's a lot more philanthropies like Earth Bezos Fund that are focusing on climate, on biodiversity, on nature, and that is something that we certainly welcome as we have our own targets and metrics at the IDB to try to achieve those more easily. Last, because I don't want to overextend myself on this, there is a big opportunity here to, through this, from these events, from these papers, to really engage more MDVs, public development banks as a whole, with philanthropies. And thank you for putting together this, Sergio. And the opportunity that we have in front of us is the G20 in Brazil. The opportunity that we have is to put it in the agenda. We hear a lot about capital adequacy frameworks, reviews, and balance sheet optimization, and private sector mobilization. I think a lot of this can be achieved if we work together as a system. And the system usually refers us to ourselves, banks. I think the system should be broader than the banks. So we should change a little bit of the narrative. And we have this opportunity, wonderful opportunity, that all the Brazilian colleagues that will be in charge of the G20 are here around us to go talk to them. But certainly there is room for that. I was going to talk a little bit about the changing of the narrative. I don't want to bore. I think we might go to if there's time, to a second round. And that's it. Thank you.
Wonderful. I do think we will have a time for a second round, and I will probably have time to give the floor for questions from the audience. So if any of you have any thoughts in mind, later on that might happen. So now we heard Matthias Bendersky from a multilateral development bank, and we have with us Natalia Diaz, who's the managing director for BNDES, the Brazilian Development Bank, one of the largest national development banks in the world, a founder of the International Development Finance Club that is currently chaired by Remy Rioux from AFD, and where Finance in Common originates from. So it's an interesting story for everybody to know. Natalia, you have taken your position recently in the beginning of this year with the new administration in Brazil, and you already have been starting some quite relevant new partnerships between philanthropies and PDB. So the question is similar to the one I asked Matthias. How do you suggest you improve the cooperation, and tell us a little bit about the portfolio that is under your direct supervision and the general strategy going forward. The floor is yours, and it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Sergio. Thank you all. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for ASEBRI for coordinating the article. I think it's really powerful for us to have such a high-level discussion in this forum and actually come up with an action plan to bring together public and the private sector to work around a common goal that we all have. I think, well, I would like to give a few steps back and just to reflect on the fact that every day when we read the papers, we keep seeing numbers growing for us to achieve the 2030 agenda growing. So estimates, they hang from 3.5 trillion per year to 5 trillion per year. I don't know the exact number, but what we all know is that we need to scale up climate financing from billions to trillions, right? And I think that the idea, and sometimes something that is not showcased as much as the number that we need to channel, is the amount of wealth that has been in the financial system. So financial assets are estimated at $350 trillion. So it's not a matter of not having resources, it's how we channel the availability and the liquidity to the right projects. And I think that when we started discussing this paper here is what we need to enable, or what is the environment that we need to create to actually bridge the gap between the providers of funding to the asset allocation. And in that sense, I would like to connect with Maria initially speaking, the role of the public development banks in doing not only the being an important agent to promote the SDG localization, because we, on one hand, we have sight of public policy, we are instruments of the government, we know how to structure and to measure impact for projects. I tend to say that public development banks, we are ESG by nature, even before the acronym was created. I think that the first climate department at BNDES was created in 1991, before ECO 92, which was the big conference that has highlighted the need for us to focus on climate. And on the other hand, we have this capacity to access different pools of liquidity. But to both points, sometimes the public and the private sector, they don't speak the same language. And I think that's really what we are talking on what we are trying to achieve by having this very open discussion. I think PDBs like BNDES, we could do a lot more if we are innovative in the way that we design the products and how we can support the initiatives that we need to finance. I mean, if we need to scale up, there is no doubt that we cannot finance all the projects that we need to push forward on the 2030 agenda by just using our own capital. There is this whole discussion around the multilateral and how we are going to channel that. But I think that we need to be very much focused on how we use our own resources to crowd in the private sector. And this might be simple, it's easier said than done, because we need to face resistance internally in the system. And I have the privilege of having worked for 30 years on the private sector, and I'm only like 3 months on the public sector. So, and I think that we just need to understand each other and see how we can connect the dots and find this common ground where we can cooperate. To my surprise, I think BNDES, even before I joined, was already trying to do that, and we have a few examples that I would like to share with you. But we still have a challenge. And one of these initiatives is that we did this first public tender process to select blended finance structures, and whereby we committed our own concessional or grants to actually call and develop projects in 3 basic areas. It was circular economy, social and environmental projects, and also in urban development. And to our surprise, we received more than 100 propositions from players that that involved a combination of philanthropic capital and commercial capital. And we ended up selecting 11 projects that will have a major impact in terms of savings of greenhouse gas emission, in keeping people stay to their territories, and promoting projects in the biogas and in other sectors. But the difficulty that we have whenever we are discussing that, when we are now, and one of the projects is the agricultural certificate of agricultural receivables that Renata mentioned before, is really, this is small. So this specific call, we committed $10 million of concessional funds from BNDES, but we were able to leverage up to $200 million from the private sector. The scale is small, but what we try to do is really to create successful cases so that we can prove the concept and then advance. And there are other ways that in which that we can scale up, one of them being just to select asset managers of impact asset managers that can kind of deploy the initiatives to us, and this is something that we are thinking how we can do that in a much larger scale. The other program that we have is the Floresta Viva, which is a matchmaking platform to recover degraded areas in the Amazon. And it's basically where we are working together with philanthropic capital, and we are doubling the amount of money that they are investing in that initiative just to advance on the social agenda. We have other initiatives, like we have a startup acceleration program that we on purpose decide only to accelerate impact startups. We added diversity, equity, and inclusion lens to that. So in this year edition, we are selecting either startups that are managed by women or that are solving women's problem. And of course, I mean, we want to scale that up in terms of addressing other basic needs that we have in Brazil. And we are integrating that with our investments to seed and growth capital funds that we have to also foster SMEs to scale up and to grow. So these are some of the initiatives, but the point that I'm trying to make is that they're small compared to the scale that we need. So I think that what we have to do is really, and we cover infrastructure investors, we cover the bank market, the debt capital markets, but we don't have someone specifically focused within BNDES to talk to the philanthropic capital. And this is one of the initiatives that we want to continue, because we need to listen to or understand your mandate on one hand, and so that we can channel and select the projects within the portfolio that can kind of, that we can create this collaboration among us. So, and we need to invest a lot on having more forums like this one, because as I started to say, I think that we need to do a lot of education inside the public development banks, inside the private market, so that we can show that it's not a matter of using public funds to transfer returns to the public sector, as sometimes we hear, but it's really trying to attract catalytic capital to de-risk a project and make that project feasible, because if it was not for that catalytic capital, the project wouldn't be there. And so it's about that. It's about creating a governance that can put different actors together in the same table to discuss and to find common ground to advance on the agenda. So these are my initial thoughts, and I'm happy to share more details as we go alongside on the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Natalia. We're now going back to the philanthropies, the networks of philanthropies. We have with us Javier Moritan, who is directly involved, heads a very large network of civil society and philanthropies in Argentina. Javier, we were just talking about the theme you will address now, which is the last mile, right? How to mobilize resources and really get to the last mile. And this is very interesting because some of the people in the audience, they have attended other Financing Common Summits before, the first, second, and third editions. And some of the panels back then, even one that I was involved in the very first summit, really dealt with that relationship between multilateral development banks, regional development banks, national development banks, subnational development banks, and how really to make these resources reach the end, the knowledge, the instruments, and the knowledge even of the terrain. So over to you to a little bit address that from the point of view of Philanthropies and your own experience. So feel free to also tell us a little bit the work that you do and your organization. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sergio, and good afternoon to everybody. I'm Javier García Moritán, Executive Director of the Group of Foundations and Companies in Argentina. And it is a non-profit association comprised of 75 of the most important companies and foundations in our country. And we are not created just to say to our members that they are doing everything well, but try to make them the best actors for public good. That is our mission. And okay, and I was wondering about some figures related to the investment that philanthropy invests every year for development, and it is about $46 million every year. And you can believe that that's a lot of money, and I think that is right. But if you compare with the amount of money that is invested every year by the business as usual or traditional investment, it is just the 0.2%. And going beyond these figures, when you try to analyze that philanthropy is really trying to work to solve some of the most crucial challenges that we face as society, to create more equal societies, to fight climate change, to promote more democratic institutions, with the 0.2% of the movement of money a year, I don't think that's possible, really. So that makes me believe that if we don't align efforts on the territory, it will be impossible. And I believe that we need also to move beyond this kind idea of creating spaces for dialogue, multi-actoral, multi-stakeholder partnerships. Of course, that will be the first step. Then you'll need to create some incentives to put every actors together, because I guess that we need to prioritize the needs of the territory more than the view or the vision that we can have as actors individually. So there is an idea that says that mostly in our institutions, we are moving forward by an idea of an individualistic sustainability approach. Like we are trying, if we are companies, to be the most sustainable company. If we are an NGO, we are trying to do the best for our board. I don't know. We are trying to be the best that we can, but paying attention to an individualistic perspective. And I think we need to move to the next step, and that is the collective action. Like, if we can put together the individualistic contribution, we are not solving the more structural problems. So that's why I believe that we need to move from individualism as a method to the collective action. And who will be the one that can have the word to say which will be the main subjects in which we need to invest together? And of course, that will be bring from these kind of spaces of discussion. And I believe that we need to listen to the territory, as Renata told, and everybody shared here. But we need to do like a big effort to move from my strategic, specifically focus on investment, to the needs of the territory. And I'm not trying to say that it's not legitimate that each actor can have their own approach or the best way in which they can invest, but we need to put first the need of the territory and then like the individualistic approach. And for that, you need to create like public-private spaces for dialogue, but also to create public policy to accelerate the path of contributing together to the main needs of the territory. In Argentina, we are facing an experience in which we are nowadays investing in 10 Argentinian cities, trying to put together civil society, companies, and local governments, municipalities. And the challenge there is to discuss which are the main priorities of the territory, and then to create different incentives, because as I tried to share with you at the beginning, if we are not able to involve private sector, not just from their business perspective, but also as social and political actors, we are not going to solve the problems of a city. I'm not talking about a country or the world, but starting from a city, we need to align efforts. And there are many innovative initiatives that we can reply around the world, like maybe, of course, you will be thinking about tax incentives, but there are also like reputational incentives, like to give a company who is committed to the main priorities of this territory a recognition that says a company committed to society or to community. And we are facing this experience that makes us enthusiastic because, for instance, in a city in the surrounding areas of Mendoza in Argentina, we could make that many different companies invest together in a problem that was the main priority identified by society. When I say society, I mean social actors, universities, also companies and philanthropies. And the project was to close the digital gap in education in the 45 schools of that city. And the budget needed for the municipality to invest by their own, it would take like 7 years of investment. And we created with the local legislature a policy that gives some benefit, mostly reputational benefits, so we could close the digital gap. Instead of waiting for 7 years, the 50% of the challenge was solved in less than a year. So this is inspired by, many of you may heard about Mariana Mazzucato, this Italo-American economist, who speaks about mission economy. And she reflected on the experience when humankind could put the man on the moon in the late 60s. And she explains that that wasn't a huge achievement only of the American government or the NASA. There were 400 industry sectors working together, like software, food industry, materials, chemistry, working together to achieve that goal that was putting the man on the moon. She reflected, and we got inspired by her, how can we create new missions in which the target would be like eradicating poverty or solving climate change issues. So I believe that we need to promote more innovative instruments, not waiting for the conversion of the souls of the people, but to create incentives that make people convenient to work together to solve the most pressing social issues. And I am really enthusiastic with this idea of matching together philanthropies and PDBs, because if we don't do that, if we don't contribute to public good, there is no contribution at all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Javier. We now have with us the UN Resident Coordinator for Colombia and the region, Mireia. Mireia, the work that philanthropies and especially the PDBs do, and this has been a major theme for the Financing Common, it started a little bit with the United Nations in a way, and the reference is the following. We are in the era of 3 very relevant international agreements that were born in 2015 under the aegis of the United Nations. I'm talking about the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, that it's a result of the third international conference on financing for development that took place in Addis. I'm talking, of course, about the Paris Agreement on climate change. And of course, I'm talking about the Agenda 2030 that brought to us the 17 SDGs. So 8 years, here we are, trying to put together philanthropies, PDBs, governments, private sector, everybody to work together to implement programs that tackle the issues that were introduced by that agenda. That's your work also to coordinate all the UN agencies and programs in this region. You heard the testimony of very relevant players here. So I'll give you the floor for you to react on these experiences and the role that you and the UN agencies play here in the region. So our pleasure to have you with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I'm really happy that you've invited me and you let me be in this special space for public development banks and philanthropies. And clearly we have a distinct governance, but I think we're motivated by the same. So I think so much of what you've said resonates with our own experience. I wanted to, and I think it could be extrapolated, many of the comments and recommendations that have come out of the paper, I think are particularly pertinent for our relationship, either in a triangular way, but bilaterally with you. So I just wanted to share some of those. And you mentioned the Addis Ababa agenda, and I think in recent years you may have seen a slightly different UN in posture around financing issues. I mean, we were obsessed about ODA, and we would talk only to planning and finance ministers, and we came to a situation where we had to get out of our offices and to engage with the real world. And I think these last, I would say, 5-6 years have really put us to the test, and I think also put us in the beginning of a journey that I think has much more ahead of us, but that has meant a transformation on my role as resident coordinator, but also the way agencies that serve in a specific country work together among themselves, but also with others. In this journey, we have acquired some additional capacities. I have people now in my office that come from the finance investment world. I don't recruit within the UN anymore. I go out there. I have enough UN colleagues. I know them all very well. I've been 27 years with the organization. So I need to surround myself with other talents, other expertise and experiences in life. I think the agencies in different ways and sizes, they have deployed tools to engage with the private sector. We've worked a lot on measurement issues because that was really what our background and maybe best experience laid. And I think we have a lot of better data that we used to have on what the financing ecosystems in the countries is, and we're trying to use that to shape our own advice to governments and our own programming. In short, I think we were taken out of our comfort zone, no doubt. And I'd like to say that in addition to, knocking shyly the door on the ecosystem, we've also started doing structuring, and we've implemented projects. We've done blended here in the most conflict-affected parts of Colombia. We just closed the evaluation of 7 operations that we did, mostly in the productive side, working with cocoa producers, acai, all sorts, different instruments, different investments, in some cases with funds, some cases with private enterprises, sometimes with banks, and I have to say with foundations and with bank holdings in particular in our case. So we've gone through that and we've come quite okay at the other end of it. And I think we're now launching a second round. So you can do blended finance and recommit private sector investments for the populations that are, most left behind. We did some interesting work, and Matthias will know that, in Uruguay in a very different context. I started knocking on the doors of private banks and telling them about the UN and how we wanted to support the second energy transition in Uruguay. and that they should trust us, that we were not going to keep the money. We would create a professional investment bank structure so that they would be comfortable with it. And now it's taken quite a while because we have other problems in whether our mechanisms are adapted for that. But we now have 4 banks that are putting money and also leveraging, not to the scale of the experience of the Brazilian bank, but we've managed to get private investments to support, what's a government-owned policy, which is a second energy transition. So it's possible, it has happened. There are people like me in the UN that are doing these things. But clearly, we're doing it with very precarious capacities and structure and mechanisms. I was saying that the blend that was done, and in fact, it started way before I arrived, we treat the co-investors with the same contract modalities that we buy, paper clips for the office or do the maintenance of our photocopiers. We don't have that modality that you grant money to someone or you have a vendor who provides you a service. We don't have, the organization is not shaped. So we're working also to elevate this experience globally so that we can really, come to much more efficient processes. Ultimately, going forward, what we really want to see, at least in Latin America, is a real big portfolio, not just ours, of financing solutions to the big issues that governments are going to bring to the SDG Summit this month. Because we have asked governments to go and tell them how they're going to change their countries and the world through it. And I think we should partner with them and offer them solutions as to how to bring to reality those policy transformations that they are adopting. So we're going to have a large portfolio of proposals that the governments are going to be put in all regions of the world. And I think we should look at that and see how that can be supported through this collective effort. Some of the things that were mentioned that, in terms of the recommendations of the paper that really came home to me, one is we all think that we have value and respective expertise. But I'd like to hear from you what you see that we have, because I realize that there are many things that we can offer, and I only come to terms with that when I hear someone else telling me. That's what you could really bring to the table, not you, Mireia, clearly the organization. So I think the more we trust each other and are willing to listen to each other, the more we can realize what is the edge that we bring to that equation. I mean, I'd like to think we bring both the very local and the very global. We know the territories, we are there, we have a footprint, we've been there for decades. We have, a margin to take risks. I don't think we're the most conservatives, we're taking risks. We do process, but we take risks. And as I said, we've done a lot of project design over the years, so the whole issue of pipeline development and measuring come relatively easy. But there may be other things that are more intangible, like the trust or the legitimacy in particular context that we don't usually, put the blue flag, the blue flag, sorry, but others value in us. So I think listening to each other and identifying the strengths of the other one is quite useful. A second thing is the paper talks about change from a systems-focused approach to development. I'm also the humanitarian coordinator in Colombia. And it's very painful to see how much money and resources we have to invest every year, both on conflict, but also on disasters in La Mojana, territories that get flooded every season. And this is, the grain source of the country. So we've done a lot of thinking internally as to how one of the things we should collectively do is really equip the development designs to prevent the need for humanitarian assistance. And so there too, if we could partner with others to think what that would look like, we spend $500 million in projects in Colombia, the UN. I mean, if we were to leverage, I'm not saying, 10 to 200, but 1 to 5, maybe we'll get to the levels of the Bezos Foundation, and we can do things that are really meaningful and at scale. But today we're very constrained. So this is part of a much bigger reflection that I think those that are in development cooperation and the humanitarian world and in peace is how in a middle-income country like Colombia, not to say in high-income countries like when we were in Uruguay, we could really tie everything we do to some others' leveraging capacity. And so my leveraging and my scale, it's not so much of the resources that I'll bring, you're all bigger than me, but I can move a development community. I can move the practices within the site. Well, not me, but that's the conversation we're trying to have. And so we have other places where we meet each other. And I think we should go local and we should go global, because those of us in the UN that have pushed a little bit things and done things, albeit small in scale, have an opportunity to showcase it and have a contagious effect with other parts of the UN. There are now conversations about a global fund from the private sector within the UN structures. But what's important is to equip our country teams with the attitude, I would say, and the openness to be able to try and fail at times, but also succeed others. And I think that's something that those that have moved a little bit the needle need to push forward. So we're going to do a second round of blended here in Colombia. We're going to be coming out soon. We're using a multi-partner trust fund that we have. I must say, these are funding decisions that we're doing with the government. So we're also telling the government and the donors that sit at the table, this works, and I'm going to give wings to your money because now we're going to join and partner with others. And we're very, very conscious, and with this I close and connect very much with the comments that Javi made, is on the local capacities. I think this is a country, 40% of the municipalities in Colombia are under some degree of control of an armed group. The state is not present, or it's in a very weak situation. And I mean the state, public forces, but also public services. So you're here, Cartagena is lovely. If you go to Bogota, you'll see, almost a first world country in itself. But the reality out there is very, very different. And the capacities that are installed in the municipalities to manage, to indebt themselves, to structure, to do what we have to do to bring development about are quasi non-existent. So I think there is a very strong need that these conversations also happen locally. And I would invite you that, whether it's in the next iteration of this meeting or in another space, we travel together to those territories. And you could see and we could co-create the kind of support that we need to offer there. Thanks.
Thank you, Mireia. Thanks for the testimony. We are now very close to the end of the session, so I'm not so sure we will have time for questions, unfortunately. But I would like to hand the floor back to Maria Eugenia, so that she can sort of help me wrap up the main conclusions and findings of this session. And so, Maria Eugenia, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergio. And I want to thank my fellow panelists for all your contributions to this discussion. It is a challenge to summarize and to share all the key messages that we shared here. So the invitation is to read the white paper that is online, available online. I'm going to focus on some key messages that we shared here. One is reinforce that philanthropy has the flexibility to innovate and has local knowledge. And that is related to one of the recommendations of the paper, that is that philanthropy should ensure that the voices and the perspective from civil society and local communities is on the table when we are partnering to innovate and contribute in addressing development needs. Another key messages is that we need to create knowledge and document cases to show the impact of these collaborations and identify the lessons learned and the best way to scale up the initiatives that are in place. Another key messages that I would like to highlight is the need to listen each other. Many of you say that we need to understand each other to establish a good and an effective collaboration. And that's one of the reasons why we are proposing to continue the building this partnership between public development banks and philanthropies through a thematic working group to have the space to discuss and invite different actors, such as the UN offices, to build the trust between us and then co-create solutions. And finally, I would like to highlight that one of the key messages is that we need to ensure that we're moving from dialogues, like this one, to concrete actions, and that is something that the paper emphasized, and for that reason there are a roadmap and next steps that we are proposing to continue this discussion. And finally, well, ensure that we have the conditions for philanthropy to partner with public development banks and different actors to contribute to solve all the problems that the world is facing today. So thank you, Sergio.
Thank you, Maria Eugenia. I would like to call a round of applause to all the participants here. Thank you so much for having attended the session. Thank you for all of you who collaborated with this. And I think we now have some suggestions for going forward. I hope we will be able to really make this happen and see even more collaborations, innovative instruments put in place, many cases beyond the ones that are referenced in the white paper, so that we could come next year and see some very interesting cooperations in contributing to the 3 UN agreements that I referenced, and in the last mile, as Javier mentioned, really touching people's lives. Thank you all so much for being here today.